What's going on, boxing fans? It's Julian Williams with The Distance. I have a video for you guys today. This one is another mailbag question. Haven't done one of these in a while, and I do encourage you guys to send me mailbag questions, and I will answer them on video for you. But anyway, this one is from KCC8. He sent this one to me a couple weeks ago. I didn't get a chance to get to this one. But this question was, what are my thoughts on the careers in the fights, Nigel Benn and Chris Eubank, something along those lines. But I'll start off with Chris Eubank. Chris Eubank overall was a really good boxer. Highly skilled. Really, he was really big out in the UK. In the United States. See, I was a kid when he was fighting. When he was fighting Nigel Benn. And as a kid, I wasn't aware of, I wasn't aware that there was boxing outside the United States. Being in so I'm not sure if Chris Eubank was even big here in the United States, but I do know he was really big in the UK. I know that he made a lot of money and had a lot of endorsements and sponsors out in the UK, and but I've seen his fights, and I've seen that he had some really good victories over some former champions and titles. So overall, he had a pretty good career. But a lot of European fighters are now coming over to the United States. And he did come to the United States very early in his career, but later in his career, he kind of just stayed out in the UK, and he stayed out in the UK and just continued fighting there. And I don't blame him, because he had a following out in the UK. He was more than likely gonna make more money out there than he would out here in the United States. So I don't blame him for not leaving the UK. But at the end of the day, at the end of his career, a lot of people think of him as the man who lost his championship to Joe Calzaghe, and the man that whose career I believe his career ended losing to Carl Thompson at cruiserweight. But overall, he had a really good career, if you ask me. Looking at his fights and seeing former champions and titles on his resume, and beating former champions and titles doesn't make you a great fighter necessarily, because like they say, styles make fights. But Eubank was a really good overall skilled boxer. And if you guys get a chance, check out some Chris Eubank fights. Preferably the one I'm about to talk about in a minute. But I think the problem. Well, I'll go with Nigel Benn now, and I'll just kind of contrast him in a way. Nigel Benn had a good career as well. He came from came over here to the United States, and I think he beat Iran Barkley in his own hometown in Vegas, back in like the late '80s, early '90s. But Nigel Benn came across the pond as well, and was fighting a lot of pretty good fighters. But Nigel Benn, a lot of people are gonna remember Nigel Benn from. Unfortunately, a lot of people aren't gonna remember Nigel Benn as the good fighter that he was. A lot of people are gonna remember him from the matchup with Gerald McClellan. A lot of people are gonna remember him from that. And just looking at the matchup, it was just awful. Because Nigel Benn didn't know that was gonna happen to him. No fighter knows what their capabilities are in a fight. A lot of people on the outside, probably people in the Benn camp didn't know that Gerald McClellan, was rehydrating like 20 pounds, or 18, 20 pounds, rehydrating back up to like 190. And other than that, he was hitting the head. He was actually hitting the head quite a bit. But I guess in a way, you can't really blame Nigel Benn for what happened to Gerald McClellan. And a lot of people and Ben went on to blame himself, for it. Constantly still blames himself to this day, but he does hold charity events for McClellan and stuff, and but by no means is Nigel Benn guilty for it. McClellan wasn't taking care of himself. I've seen the documentaries that said he was rehydrating a lot, and his weight was just going up a whole lot during fights, and I think Emmanuel Stewart saw problems with McClellan and stopped training him. But Nigel Benn, his career never recovered from that, and I just remember years ago, before I even started watching boxing, and I actually heard about it. And I didn't hear about it necessarily, looking in a newspaper, because as a kid I used to read, I used to read the sports pages, and I would look up, fights, it happened on I think HBO and Showtime. I think McClellan Ben came on Showtime, but I actually think a clip came on ESPN, and I was horrified by it, and because I actually thought McClellan was dead looking at that clip, and I actually didn't really I saw the fight. I seen the fight up to like the 5th round, but just because I don't want to see that again. I've seen clips, but that's all. But overall, Nigel Benn had a good career himself. People aren't gonna remember the fights. They're gonna remember the fight with Eubank and the fight with Barkley. But what's always gonna overshadow that is the fight with Gerald McClellan. That's always gonna overshadow that, and that's the real shame of it all. But overall, the fights with Eubank and Nigel Benn, Judgment Day, the first fight, one of the best fights I've ever seen. Because overall, it was just back and forth. Somebody would have control of the matchup, and then all of a sudden the next fighter would have control of the matchup. Both fighters were getting hurt. There were fouls in the fight. It was kind of your boxer puncher fight. Who's gonna win, the boxer or the puncher? And Chris Eubank, who was in a similar situation, he ended Michael Watson's career. And then a lot of people said that he didn't really have that instinct to go for the kill anymore after that fight. But the difference between Eubank and Ben is Eubank's career isn't going to be overshadowed by that. But the first fight, was just back and forth action. They're fighting at a very fast pace. It was just one of those blow for blow matchups, and and before I seen the fight, I didn't know what happened in the fight, but I thought Nigel Benn was gonna pull it off, but Chris Eubank, pulled off. I think like in the 8th round, knocked him out, or it was a stoppage. It was a he was landing a big combination, and the ref stopped the fight. And on top of that, Nigel Benn couldn't see out of his left eye. I believe it was the left eye. He couldn't see out the left eye, and the fight was stopped. But overall, Judgment Day, that was a really good fight. If you guys haven't seen that fight, I suggest you check out that fight because it was really good. The second fight was close. I thought Nigel Benn won the second fight. I really did. I thought Nigel Benn won the second fight. It did end up being a draw. This one's for the super middleweight championship, but I thought Nigel Benn at least won it by 2 rounds, 1 or 2 rounds. It was a close back and forth matchup, but Nigel Benn and Chris Eubank, they did have good careers, but unfortunately, when people think of Nigel Benn, they're gonna think of Gerald McClellan, and that's the sad part about it, because Nigel Benn overall had a really good career. Leading up to that, before that, I thought he made his mark, but it happens sometimes. But anyway, that was the distance. If you guys have any questions, just send it to my inbox. I'll answer on video, like I said earlier in the video. But anyway, that was Distance. Thanks for watching. Peace.